Imagine for a moment that you could travel back in time and find yourself in a medieval castle, not as a noble lord or lady of the court, but as one of those anonymous souls who formed the true backbone of those majestic fortresses. You would then be one of the many servants, and believe me, the experience would be very different from anything you might imagine. When we contemplate those imposing stone structures that still dot our landscapes, we often think of lavish banquets, chivalric tournaments, and courtly intrigues. But behind those picture postcard images lies a reality far darker and more complex. For in the shadow of those thick walls lived a hard-working population now largely forgotten by official history. Servants were not just a handful of individuals scattered here and there in the castle corridors. No, they made up the overwhelming majority of the fortress's population. For every noble, for every knight, you had to count dozens, sometimes hundreds of servants. These men, women, and children formed a veritable parallel society, organized according to its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own sufferings. A servant's day began well before dawn, around 5:30 in the morning, when the first pink glimmers had not yet touched the horizon. Picture yourself awakened by the metallic clang of a bell in the freezing darkness of a winter morning. Your feet touch the cold stone floor, and already your body, sore from the previous day's labors, protests. But there is no time for complaint. The castle is awakening, and with it a complex machine of which you are only one cog among many. That day will not end until nightfall, around 7 in the evening, after more than 13 hours of uninterrupted toil. 13 hours during which your hands will have carried, cleaned, served, repaired. 13 hours during which your back will have bent under heavy loads. Your knees will have knelt before nobles. Your voice will have fallen silent before authority. And tomorrow, after a few precarious hours of sleep, it will all begin again. But first, let us speak of the hierarchy that governed your existence, for even among servants, not all shared the same fate. At the top of this pyramid of servitude stood the household officers, the seneschal, responsible for the castle's administration, the chamberlain, who oversaw the lord's private apartments, and the carver, honored with serving directly at the master's table. Such privileged positions were not open to ordinary mortals. They required education, connections, and above all, a birth that predestined you for such responsibilities. The squire, for example, was often a young man of good family learning the codes of nobility by serving an established lord. For him, this servitude was temporary, a necessary step towards eventual knighthood. You, an ordinary servant, were far removed from such considerations. Your place lay in the lower rungs of that pitiless hierarchy. Perhaps you were a simple valet, tasked with cleaning and maintenance. Perhaps a maid, assigned to the kitchens, the laundry, or the cleaning of apartments. Or perhaps a groom, responsible for the horses and the stables. Each of these positions had its own constraints, its own humiliations, its own dangers. The groom, for instance, spent his days in the foul, noisy world of the stables. Horses, powerful and unpredictable animals, could shatter a leg or crush a skull with a single kick. The stench of manure permeated his clothes, his skin, his hair. That smell followed him everywhere, marking his social condition in an indelible way. In the kitchens, the atmosphere was just as grueling, though of a different nature. The heat of fires kept constantly alight turned those spaces into true furnaces, especially in the summer months. The kitchen boys, often very young, bustled in the stifling heat, turning spits, fanning flames, carrying enormous cauldrons of boiling water. Burns were commonplace, and few completed their apprenticeship without bearing on their bodies the scars of their labor. The most thankless tasks were reserved for the humblest servants, often the youngest or most recently arrived. Cleaning the latrines, for example, was among the most repugnant and despised chores. These medieval toilets, usually built jutting out from the ramparts, dumped their filth into the moats or simply onto the surrounding land. Yet they had to be cleaned regularly, the solid waste removed, fresh straw spread. Imagine that task for a moment, the acrid, lingering stench that grips your throat as you approach, the repugnance of your gestures, the shame of your condition. Yet the job was necessary. Someone had to do it. That someone was you, a nameless, gloryless servant, invisible to chroniclers who recorded only the exploits of the powerful. But the physical harshness of the work was nothing compared to the constant moral humiliation. Your very existence depended on the Lord's good pleasure. At any moment, for the slightest fault, for a clumsy gesture, for a look deemed insolent, you could be dismissed without notice, without compensation, without recourse. That permanent precariousness weighed on your shoulders like a slab of lead.
Worse still, this insecurity deepened with the master's comings and goings. Whenever the Lord departed on a journey, to war, or on pilgrimage, part of the staff was instantly dismissed. Extra mouths to feed became an unnecessary burden, and the castle's economy demanded these human sacrifices. Overnight, you could find yourself out on the roads, without resources, without protection, exposed to the dangers of a hostile world. This insecurity created a climate of constant tension among the servants. Everyone strove to make themselves indispensable, to please the masters, to avoid the slightest mistake that might justify dismissal. Such fierce competition poisoned relations between colleagues, breeding rivalries, denunciations, betrayals. Justice in this universe was summary and brutal. Even the smallest theft was punished exemplarily. A servant caught stealing a piece of bread might be publicly whipped, branded with a hot iron, or, in extreme cases, hanged. The line between survival and theft was often thin, however. When hunger gnawed the belly, when children cried from malnutrition, temptation could become stronger than fear of punishment. Penalties were not limited to theft. A gesture deemed disrespectful, a delay in performing a task, a clumsiness that caused material damage, anything could warrant sanction. Punishments ranged from a mere slap to flogging to the pillory, that public exposure which added social humiliation to physical pain. Yet perhaps the most troubling aspect of this servile condition was the fact that part of the population accepted it, indeed, sought it out. Paradoxical as it may seem, positions as castle servants were coveted. This eagerness reveals the extreme harshness of life outside those protective walls. For a free but destitute peasant, becoming a castle servant represented a form of social elevation. True, he lost his freedom, but he gained security. A roof, however precarious, even if shared with many others. Meals, however meager, even if composed of leftovers from the Lord's table. Clothing, however worn, even if marked in the master's colors. That material security, as relative as it was, felt like a luxury to someone who had known hunger, cold, and wandering. This active pursuit of servitude forces us to question the very nature of freedom in the Middle Ages. What is it to be free if that freedom means starving by the roadside? What is it to be free if it exposes you to bandits, epidemics, famines? For many, servitude within the castle paradoxically represented liberation. Liberation from uncertainty, from the constant anxiety of tomorrow, from the specter of death by starvation. Servants' lodgings reflected their social status perfectly. While the nobles resided in the upper floors of the keep in spacious, heated apartments, the servants were crammed into the service quarters, utilitarian buildings erected in the castle's outer bailey. Designed above all for functionality, these spaces left little room for individual comfort. Most of the time you slept in the great hall, that multi-purpose space that served as refectory by day and dormitory by night. Stretched out on a simple straw mattress, wrapped in a rough blanket, you shared the room with dozens of other servants. Privacy was an unknown luxury. Snores, nighttime groans, body odors, parasites, everything was shared in this enforced promiscuity. Winter turned those already precarious conditions into a genuine survival ordeal. Stone walls, excellent for defense, proved merciless for thermal comfort. Cold seeped through every opening, rose from the paved floor, descended from the damp vaults. A single central hearth, when it existed, struggled to warm those immense volumes. The spots closest to the fire were hotly contested, creating an informal hierarchy within the servant group itself. Yet the castle's spatial organization revealed a deeper truth about medieval society. The surface area of the service buildings often exceeded that of the principal living quarters. This proportion perfectly illustrated the servants' numerical importance relative to their masters. A castle was above all an economic and military machine, and that machine needed arms, many arms. Medieval architects had fully integrated this reality into their plans. Kitchens, stables, workshops, cellars, barns, every service space was sized to accommodate a considerable laboring population. A castle without its servants was an empty shell, however impressive its walls and towers. This numerical importance, however, did not translate into social recognition. On the contrary, the more numerous the servants, the more they tended to become invisible to their contemporaries. Medieval chronicles overflow with anecdotes about noble life, their feats of arms, their alliances, their betrayals, but they pass over in silence the existence of that anonymous multitude who made their lifestyle possible. Such historical invisibility is partly explained by the widespread illiteracy of the working classes. Servants could neither read nor write, so they left no direct testimony of their experience. Their voice reaches us only filtered through the gaze of literate elites, who perceived them as an undifferentiated mass of laborers. Yet behind this apparent anonymity lay individual destinies, hopes, sufferings, and sometimes revolts. Resignation was not always the rule. Some servants attempted to escape, to regain their lost freedom. But such flights were dangerous. A fugitive serf was hunted down, tracked, and his capture brought exemplary punishment meant to discourage others from similar attempts.
Some, more astute or simply luckier, managed to improve their lot by other means. Learning a specialized craft could open prospects of advancement. A valet who acquired the skills of a smith, a carpenter, or a mason gained value in his master's eyes. Such technical competencies made him harder to replace and afforded him a measure of job security. The church, too, offered a path of social ascent for the better educated. A young servant able to read and write might hope to become a clerk, a copyist, or an accountant. Even modest positions of that kind lifted him out of the anonymous mass of manual laborers and granted him an intermediate status, halfway between outright servitude and genuine freedom. For most, however, these escapes remained illusory. Social reproduction was the rule. A servant's son became a servant. A maid's daughter married a valet. Masters encouraged that continuity, seeing in it a guarantee of loyalty and competence. A servant born within the castle knew the place, the routines, the master's preferences, making him more efficient than any newcomer. Family life for servants was likewise governed by the constraints of their condition. Marriages had to be approved by the lord, who reserved the right to pair couples to suit his interests. A skilled kitchen maid might be wed to an experienced groom, in the hope that their children would inherit both sets of abilities. Such arranged unions ignored personal feelings and affinities. The birth of a child in a servile family was an ambivalent event. On the one hand, it meant another mouth to feed on an already tight budget. On the other, it represented an investment for the future, a potential worker who might one day support aging parents. Yet that hope was overshadowed by the era's high infant mortality. Servants' children began working very young, at 7 or 8. Their first tasks were simple: carrying messages, scrubbing floors, helping in the kitchen. But early labor deprived them of any formal education. They grew up in ignorance, perpetuating the cycle of servitude through sheer unawareness of the outside world. A few children, though, partly escaped that fate. Sons of impoverished noble families could become pages, the first rung toward possible knighthood. These boys learned courtly manners, horsemanship, and the handling of weapons. Their servitude was temporary and educational. vastly different from that of children drawn from laboring classes. Pages inhabited an intermediate realm, neither quite servants nor truly nobles. They shared the knight's daily life while still performing domestic chores. That ambiguous status let them observe power up close and learn elite social codes. Some seized the chance and did climb the social ladder. Others remained stuck, too refined for ordinary servitude, yet not noble enough for knighthood. Food was a central concern for servants. In theory, they were entitled to the pittance, a daily ration included in their wages. In practice, the quantity and quality of that food depended entirely on the master's generosity and the castle's stores. During lean times, servants suffered the first cutbacks. Their portions were reduced to preserve those of nobles and soldiers. The food hierarchy mirrored the social order. Everyone ate according to rank, and servants sat at the very bottom of that nutritional ladder. A servant's daily fare consisted mainly of coarse brown bread made from rye and oats, a far cry from the white bread reserved for the Lord's table. That often stale loaf formed the foundation of every meal, accompanied by a thin vegetable soup, cabbage, turnips, leeks, simmered in a meager broth. Meat was rare, kept for feast days or noble leftovers. Such monotonous, protein-poor fare had direct consequences for health. Rickets, anemia, and other deficiencies marked servants' bodies and weakened their constitutions. Their life expectancy was drastically shorter than that of privileged classes. Many died young, worn out by labor and deprivation. Personal hygiene was an almost unreachable luxury. Hot water was scarce and precious, kept chiefly for the Lord's baths. Servants washed in cold water when they could, in courtyards or near wells. Wearing the same clothes day after day, they became imbued with sweat, grease, and assorted odors. Fleas and lice thrived in that underwashed crowd. This neglect was more than a matter of comfort. It carried grave sanitary implications. Epidemics spread swiftly in such packed, weakened populations. Plague, typhus, dysentery regularly cut swaths through servant ranks, their mortality proportionally higher than that of nobles, who were better nourished and better housed. Servants' clothing likewise reflected their station. They wore garments of coarse cloth, wool serge or hemp dyed in dull hues. Designed to last and to withstand physical work, these clothes valued function over appearance. Bright colors, fine fabrics, and ornamentation were barred from laboring classes by strict sumptuary laws. On top of that, servants often donned a livery in their master's colors, marking them instantly as belonging to a particular lord. It was a social brand, permanently reminding both wearer and onlooker of the servant's subordinate status. Even in appearance, individuality was denied them.
Leisure was nearly non-existent. Their few free moments went to vital necessities, eating, sleeping, mending tools or garments. Noble pastimes, hunting, tournaments, poetry, were entirely alien. At best, the servants could watch from afar, passive spectators of their masters' lives. Occasionally, on great religious feasts, a relative relaxation descended upon the castle. These exceptional moments allowed a few songs or folk dances in the service yards. Yet those recreations were brief and supervised. The servant's joy must not upset the established order or call the hierarchy into question. Religion held a special place in servants' lives. On one hand, it gave moral comfort, promising divine justice that would redress earthly inequalities. Sermons assured the humble of a reward in the hereafter, provided they accepted their present lot with resignation. That eschatological promise worked as a safety valve, redirecting frustration toward a hypothetical spiritual future. On the other hand, the church itself was a temporal lord, owning castles, lands, and servants. Abbeys and bishoprics reproduced the same hierarchies,
the same exploitation as secular seigneuries. A monastery servant was little better off than a castle servant, despite gospel precepts of equality and charity. That contradiction between Christian teaching and ecclesiastical practice did not always escape servants. Some developed a critical view of a religion that preached love of neighbor while condoning their exploitation. Such questioning could lead to forms of popular heresy, harshly repressed by both religious and civil authorities. Technological advances of the medieval era gradually altered servants' working conditions. Better farming techniques, new tools, the mechanization of certain tasks slowly changed daily routines, but these improvements did not necessarily translate into better social standing. More often, new technology increased productivity without lessening toil. A servant might accomplish more with improved tools, yet the extra yield benefited only the master. The profits of progress were captured by those who owned the means of production, perpetuating existing inequalities. Some innovations could even worsen servants' situation. The installation of a new water mill, for instance, might render several millers obsolete. Such progress generated unemployment avant la lettre, casting now useless workers onto the roads. Professional reconversion was difficult in a society where trades were passed from father to son. Wars, frequent in the Middle Ages, regularly upended castle life, and with it, the servant's existence. In time of conflict, the castle became a besieged fortress. Servants found themselves trapped within the walls, forced either to take part in the defense or to endure the privations of siege. During such tense periods, living conditions deteriorated further. Supplies dwindled and were rationed for endurance. Servants, already last in the food hierarchy, saw their portions reduced to bare survival. Hunger became a daily companion, further weakening bodies already worn by toil. Fear also took hold. Servants knew that if the castle fell, their fate rested entirely on the victor's mercy. Some conquerors slaughtered nobles and servants alike. Others spared useful labor, but reduced survivors to slavery. In every case, war meant the utmost uncertainty for these vulnerable populations. Paradoxically, conflict could offer rare opportunities for upward mobility to the boldest. A servant who distinguished himself by courage in battle might catch his lord's eye and see his status improve. Some became soldiers, others gained increased responsibilities. Yet such exceptional promotions affected only a minute minority, and the risks were enormous. Medicine in that era was rudimentary and largely out of reach for servants. When illness struck, they could rely only on a handful of traditional remedies, often more superstitious than effective. Local herb women and village healers possessed some empirical knowledge, but their means were limited when faced with serious ailments. Work accidents were frequent and often crippling. A fall from a roof during repairs, the bite of a vicious horse, a severe kitchen burn, any of these could turn a productive servant into a useless invalid. Charity from the master was then the only safety net, and that charity was unpredictable. Some lords maintained their former servants once they became infirm, others cast them out without scruple. Old age loomed as the most dreaded horizon. When strength waned, when the back could no longer bear heavy loads, when trembling hands could no longer perform precise tasks, uselessness reared its cruel head. An aged servant became a burden to the castle community. Experience and knowledge of the household no longer compensated for physical decline. Luckily, solidarity among servants existed despite rivalries and jealousies. Younger workers sometimes helped the elderly, sharing rations or quietly taking on their more arduous chores. Such informal mutual aid forged bonds that partly offset the system's harshness. Even so, solidarity had limits. In times of scarcity or tension, Each fought first for personal survival. Self-preservation overrode compassion, revealing the brutal core of such living conditions. A stolen crust of bread, a pilfered blanket, could turn companions in misfortune into mortal enemies. Women servants faced specific hardships in this masculine and violent world. Their gender exposed them to particular dangers, especially sexual assault. A lord, a knight, even a superior servant could abuse his authority to force himself on a maid. Such violence, tolerated by the social order of the day, found no redress in seigneurial justice. A maid who became pregnant as a result faced a dire predicament. The unborn child compromised her work capacity and thus her value to the master. Some attempted clandestine abortions with the era's rudimentary methods, risking their lives in dangerous practices. Others carried the forced maternity to term, condemning the child to grow up in the same servitude.
Elderly servant women were sometimes reassigned as wet nurses or governesses to noble children. That role granted them a certain respect and relative security, sparing them the heaviest tasks while putting their experience to work in aristocratic education. Yet that promotion was reserved for a privileged few, chosen for discretion and absolute loyalty. Alcohol offered one of the few escapes from daily misery. Beer, an everyday drink in that era, was generally available to servants in moderate amounts. Masters tolerated this consumption as a social regulator. A slightly tipsy servant was less likely to brood over his condition or plot rebellion. But alcoholism could also ruin lives already hanging by a thread. A servant too fond of drink quickly lost his work capacity and thus his place in the castle. Expulsion for drunkenness often amounted to a death sentence, for the roads were merciless to destitute wanderers. Some servants cultivated artistic skills that brightened seigneurial evenings. A flute player, a storyteller, a jester could rise slightly above ordinary servitude. Such talents were prized by nobles, ever hungry for new entertainment. Yet that recognition was precarious, dependent on aristocratic tastes that shifted with the wind. The popular music of servants differed radically from courtly refinements. It drew on rural traditions, peasant laments, ancestral work songs. These simple, repetitive melodies accompanied the hardest tasks, forging a sense of communion among laborers. They also sustained a rich oral culture passed down through generations despite widespread illiteracy. Calendar feasts marked rare pauses in servants' lives. Christmas, Easter, St. John's Day allowed a few hours of rest and festivity. Lords, by tradition or political calculation, granted these exceptional breaks. Such communal joy created an illusion of social harmony among the castle's various orders. Even those festivities, however, constantly reminded everyone of social hierarchies. Servants celebrated in the service yards while nobles feasted in the great hall. Food, wine, entertainment were strictly segregated by rank, paradoxically underscoring the very inequalities the occasion pretended briefly to suspend.
Changing religious mentalities gradually influenced perceptions of servitude. Certain theologians began questioning the divine legitimacy of slavery and serfdom. Though confined to scholarly circles, such reflections slowly prepared shifts in consciousness, even if they did not immediately alter social practice. Pilgrimages offered servants rare chances to travel and discover the wider world. Some lords allowed their most trusted servants to accompany them on these spiritual journeys, long, perilous expeditions that broadened mental horizons for people normally confined within castle walls. On pilgrimage roads, social distinctions blurred somewhat. Noble and servant shared the same fatigue, dangers, and quest. These shared experiences sometimes forged lasting bonds that endured back at the castle. A few servants drew from such journeys a broadened outlook that transformed their self-perception. Most servants, however, never left the immediate vicinity of their castle. Their mental universe was bounded by the enclosing walls and the lands glimpsed from tower tops. Such geographic confinement deepened psychological dependence on their masters and limited aspirations to emancipation. As craft guilds developed in nearby towns, some servants tried to flee and join those artisan communities. These escapees sought to learn specialized trades that would grant relative economic independence. But flight was risky. A runaway serf could be pursued and forcibly returned by his lord. Customary law held that a serf became free after residing a year and a day in a town. That distant but real hope motivated certain daring escapes despite the dangers. Those who succeeded in that social metamorphosis joined the ranks of the burgeoning bourgeoisie, often forgetting their servile origins. Romantic relationships among servants were monitored and controlled by seigneurial authority. An unauthorized marriage could bring severe penalties. Such intrusion into private life illustrated the lord's far-reaching power, extending into the very intimacy of his subjects. Genuine love became a luxury hard to afford. Servants sometimes conducted clandestine romances to evade surveillance. These secret affairs lent a touch of romance to otherwise monotonous existence, yet they also entailed significant risks. Discovery could mean forced separation or expulsion from the castle. A servant's death usually went unnoticed in official chronicles. These anonymous lives extinguished without written trace, as if they had never been. Only fellow workers remembered their gestures, habits, and personalities for a time. Servants' graves reflected their social status, even in death. Buried in mass pits or cemeteries reserved for common folk, they received no funerary monuments. Their tombs, marked at best by a simple wooden cross, vanished quickly beneath vegetation. That erasure extended beyond death the social invisibility they had endured in life. Yet a few exceptional servants did leave a mark on their castle's histories. A particularly gifted cook, a remarkably skilled groom, a nurse beloved by her young charges could earn lasting affection from the seigneurial family. Such endearing figures sometimes found a place in family lore, handed down orally through the generations. The economic evolution of the late Middle Ages slowly transformed castle social relations. The rise of a money economy allowed some lords to replace in-kind services with wages. Though still embryonic, that shift opened new prospects for the most skilled workers. A waged servant gained more autonomy than one paid only in room and board. Even a modest salary let him envision a different future, save a few coins for old age, or invest in his children's education. That economic transformation foreshadowed the gradual disappearance of the traditional seigneurial system. Change, however, was slow and uneven. Many castles retained old forms of servitude, keeping their populations in traditional dependency. Social transformation advanced at different speeds depending on region, lordship, and local mentality. The servant could thus spend an entire life without encountering any system but that of his ancestors. Peasant revolts erupted periodically and sometimes touched castle servants. These uprisings, born of exasperation at mounting burdens and repeated humiliations, briefly ignited the oppressed's hopes. Servants, daily witnesses to their master's wealth, were tempted to join such insurrections. But their particular position, though, left them especially vulnerable to reprisals. Free peasants often saw castle servants as complicit with oppressors and so offered little solidarity. Caught between two hostile worlds, servants risked much by joining rebellions that were usually doomed. The repression that followed struck hard at servile communities suspected of complicity. Exemplary punishments, public hangings, mutilations, brandings, aimed to terrorize the populace and forestall any repeat. These macabre spectacles seared themselves into memory and discouraged resistance for a long time.
Despite such harsh conditions, some servants maintained remarkable human dignity. Their passive resistance, small acts of daily disobedience, preserved self-respect in the face of systematic humiliation. This moral resilience, invisible yet real, testified to the strength of the human spirit under oppression. Men and women alike devised subtle strategies to keep their humanity. Dark humor, discreet jokes, furtive gestures of solidarity created a symbolic counterpower to seigneurial authority. These micro-resistances, seemingly trivial, were in reality significant victories over dehumanization. The transmission of popular knowledge formed another kind of cultural resistance. Servants perpetuated traditions, songs, and tales beyond seigneurial control. This rich, living oral culture sustained alternative values to those of the ruling aristocracy, preserving a collective identity despite geographic and social dispersion. Women servants played a special role in that cultural transmission. Responsible for informal childhood education, they passed on practical skills, folk beliefs, and traditional family traditions. Their influence, largely unseen by male authorities, quietly shaped future generations' mindsets. Such parallel education sometimes clashed with church instruction. Folk tales, lingering pagan beliefs, traditional magic practices competed with Christian teaching. That cultural duality enriched the collective imagination, but complicated the uniform religious order authorities desired. A few particularly intelligent servants managed to educate themselves despite their condition. Attentive observation of their master's literate activities, discreet help from a compassionate cleric, personal curiosity, all these could open the door to knowledge. Such exceptional autodidacts sometimes acquired skills that changed their destiny. Mastery of writing was a potential key to emancipation. A man who could keep accounts, draft letters, or copy manuscripts became valuable to his lord, gaining relative protection and social prospects unimaginable for illiterate peers. Education, however, could also be dangerous. Knowledge fostered critical thinking, revealed the arbitrariness of social hierarchies, and nurtured aspirations hard to satisfy. An overly educated servant risked becoming rebellious, questioning the established order, and infecting comrades with subversive ideas. Shrewd lords understood that ambiguity. They encouraged technical training, useful to their economic interests, but discouraged broad culture that threatened their dominance. This selective education kept servants in a half-ignorance conducive to obedience. At the end of this plunge into the world of medieval servants, one conclusion stands out. Their condition was far more complex and nuanced than stock images suggest. These men and women were neither utterly submissive slaves nor free wage earners. They navigated a rigid yet non-monolithic social system which allowed narrow spaces for relative freedom and limited possibilities for advancement. Their existence, marked by physical hardship and social humiliation, was nonetheless not devoid of meaning or dignity. Servants developed coping strategies, solidarities, and resistances that preserved their humanity against systematic oppression. Their contribution to the construction and functioning of medieval civilization was immense, even if largely invisible in our historical sources.
Understanding their daily reality helps us grasp the complexity of past societies beyond simplistic clichés. These seemingly insignificant lives reveal deep mechanisms of social change, universal human aspirations, and the capacity for resilience under the harshest conditions. Their legacy, carried across centuries by countless unseen channels, still nourishes our contemporary culture. Folk tales, culinary traditions, artisanal skills, and pragmatic wisdom often root back to these anonymous servants' experiences. In the end, to study their history is to recognize the dignity of every human life, however modest it may appear. It is also to measure how far we have come since those distant times, while remaining vigilant about the inequalities that persist in our own societies. For the story of medieval servants reminds us that behind every social system lie individual lives, each with its hopes, its sufferings, and its indomitable humanity.